The format that we're going to follow is a presentation from Miguel Figueroa and Jeanne McGuire that will set us up for the discussion. Miguel Figueroa is the former leader of the Communist Party. He's a member of the Central Executive of the Communist Party and the current leader of the Peace Congress. And Jeanne McGuire wears many hats in the party. Among them is she's a leading member of the Central Education Commission and History Commission. She's the club organizer of the Davenport Club. And she's a former educator. Well, I say former educator, but she's still doing education, obviously. So, without further ado, I'll turn it over to Miguel to start the presentation. Thank you.
As Drew has already indicated, this particular webinar, the first of a number of webinars that the party will be organizing, not only for our own members, but also for friends and contacts in over the coming weeks. But this first webinar is focusing primarily on the economic crisis, which has been triggered by the pandemic, not caused by the pandemic. I'll come back to that in a moment, but certainly triggered by the pandemic and the deep recession, if not a full-blown depression that we will be confronted with, and the working class will be confronted with over the coming months and we think years. So without further ado, I guess what we'll do is I will first kind of lay out some of the historical context of the current crisis and some of its dynamics. And then Jeanne will talk about how the ruling class typically deals with such crises in their own interests, and what we are already seeing unfolding with respect to this particular economic crisis. What this means for the working class and for the working people more generally in Canada and internationally by extension, and then finally and outlining the policy alternatives, the people's alternative that our party is advancing. And then finally, we'll just have a very brief kind of intro into the topic which is on many comrades' minds, and that is, what can we do? How do we organize? How do we fight in these, clearly extraordinary circumstances that we all find ourselves in? So without any further ado, I'm going to start my presentation. Okay, so first of all, I thought it would be useful just to review some basics about the business cycle. What, of course, Marxists we understand to be the capitalist boom and bust character of cyclical crises under capitalism. So we're all familiar with the basics of the boom and bust economy. Why does this happen? Well, we should review that briefly, and in particular focus on both bourgeois and Marxist explanations for the cyclical nature of these crises under capitalism. Typically, they take place every 10 to 15 years. You can almost set your watches by it. But of course, there's been some changes there, which I will get into later on in my presentation. So here's a typical a graphic presentation of the peak, then the recession, or the the meltdown, leading to the bust part of the cycle, or the trough, then the gradual recovery, increased expansion, and then a petering out of that expansion up to the next peak. So how does the bourgeois economists explain this? Well, they essentially base their explanation for the end of expansion and the beginning of the crisis phase of the cyclical crisis around the question of demand. That somehow people aren't spending enough money, we're not purchasing the goods that are on the market, and therefore as demand weakens, employers and businesses cut their production and so on. So you have a situation where the supply exceeds the aggregate demand in the economy. That in turn is reflected in increases in the cost of production. And then, of course, also the factor of externalities. They could be anything from climate change, wars, other factors, government decisions and policy choices and what have you that lead to this. A loss of confidence on the market, which leads to a downturn in the stock prices, and that in turn reverberates through the economy and so on. But of course, as in contradistinction to bourgeois explanations, Marxists explain the the cyclical character of the crisis by looking at some more fundamental questions. And the first of them, of course, has to do with value versus exchange value, and this is in relationship to the value of labor or labor power. So workers, when they're producing wealth, they're imparting through their labor additional values to the inputs, to the raw materials that they're producing. That increased value, however, is not completely compensated to the workers, is not paid to the workers in the form of wages, whether it's hourly wages or piece rate wages or salaries and so on. The workers obviously get a lot less than what they actually are producing in terms of new wealth or value added. What happens to the balance of it? Well, that of course is the surplus value, and that's expropriated by the capitalists. So bourgeois economists tend to talk about underconsumption. This is, of course, to place the blame on the victims. The working class isn't consuming enough. In fact, we have an insanely consumptive-oriented economy. That is the whole nature of the capitalist commodity economy. We, however, view it as a relative overproduction rather than underconsumption, a relative overproduction in the market by the owners of the means of production, the capitalist class, and of course its monopoly core in the first instance. So what do we mean by relative overproduction? It's not necessarily that there are more goods on the market or services on the market than people need, but rather that it is relative overproduction because there is a glut of goods and services that people can't afford to purchase because of this differential between what they actually are producing in terms of value and what they're actually being paid in their pay packets. As this crisis of relative overproduction matures and these contradictions within the capitalist production process and the reproduction of capital matures over time, it eventually leads to this crisis phase, and then, of course, the downturn. Capitalists say, well, our stockpiles are jammed. We need to turn off the tap of new production, sell off our inventories. They lay off workers, and unemployment skyrockets, and so on. So just a word about the Great Depression, World War II, and the post-war period. I think everybody is familiar with all of this. What we saw coming out of the Second World War in particular began before then in small measure, but particularly after the Second World War, was the rise of Keynesian economic policy as a solution to this cyclical and highly volatile nature of the capitalist economy that had led, in fact, to the Great Depression and all of the social destruction that it wrought. So the rise of Keynesian economics and the welfare state. Keynes's idea, of course, was that in the interest of preserving capitalism, this was not to change capitalism, and rather it was to solve this accidental threat to the capitalist order, that it was necessary to flatten the curve of the business cycle. And why was it particularly attractive to ruling circles in the immediate post-war period? Well, it had a lot to do with the fact that they were worried about the growing support for a socialist alternative. Remember that during the war itself, and through the end of the war, there was people were in Western countries and third world countries learned a lot more about the Soviet Union, about socialist society, about the efforts to eliminate unemployment, to raise up the rights, not completely, but certainly to make advances in terms of women's equality, to provide universal health care, and so on. And also because of the role that communist parties had played, particularly where the Nazis and the fascists were occupying in France, in different parts of Europe, Italy, Africa, North Africa, and so on and so forth. And the fact that the communists were in the forefront, of course, of the partisan movement and the struggle against fascism. But it begs the question, why did the ruling class agree to this Keynesian economics? And in fact, it involved major concessions from the ruling class. They had to forego some of their accumulation of wealth in the form of, first of all, acceding to the growing demands of the trade union movement, of the working class, to organize unions and to enter into negotiations. Real wages tended to rise. Real wages, not just artificial increases, but real substantial increases in the income of workers relative to what they were producing. And also because the capitalist class and the corporations that they control were called upon to pay very high taxes, much higher than they pay today, in the order of 4 to 5 times as much of the tax base that governments were using were contributed by corporations in the post-war period, and even into the 60s and into the 70s, before corporate taxes were slashed, and we have a situation now where the corporate tax rate and its contribution to overall general revenues is in the order of 10 to 12%. So why did they accept it? Well, they accepted it because, in a way, it was a concession for the greater good, not for the greater good of humanity or for the greater good of the people in general, but for the greater good of their own class and ensuring the hegemony of the capitalist class. And also to curry ideas of reformism and class collaborationism within the trade union movement itself, to isolate the communists and to weaken their kind of class struggle positions, and they were able to do it, even though it involved a certain compromise or a lowering of their rate of accumulation of wealth, because overall there was an absolute growth, a significant period of expansion in the Cold War period. They had, in the post-war period, they had to rebuild all of the productive capacity that had been destroyed in much of Europe and Asia in particular. New markets for exploitation were opening up in the third world. And of course, there was rising consumption in the capitalist countries themselves. And so even though the rate of profit was lower, their absolute accumulation of wealth was going rather well. And if you look at this graph, you can see that even in terms of the income of the top 10%, shortly after the war, you see a sharp decline in terms of their relative income as a share of overall income. But they were still doing very well. The top 10% were getting 35% of income through the post-war period all the way up until the 70s. And then, of course, it starts to increase later on. I'll come back to that in a question. But significantly, the rate of profit for the capitalists was in sharp decline, from a rate of 22% in the immediate period after the war, bottoming out in the late 70s to, well, almost flattening out entirely. Now, this, of course, is a longer-term trend than the cyclical crises, but it goes hand in hand with that, and Jeanne will probably get into that a little bit more in her presentation. But the general tendency for the rate of profit to decline under capitalist production, other things being equal, is a law which Marx and Engels uncovered and wrote about, particularly in the 3 volumes of Capital, particularly Volume 1 and also in Volume 3 more extensively. And they were very clear to say that it's a tendency for the rate of the rate of profit to decline, and they pointed out that there are countervailing factors. And as we will see, of course, we have just lived through this countervailing efforts by the capitalist class to reverse this fall in the rate of profit. But it's an important question, and explains a lot about why economic policy changed in the Cold War period through Keynesianism and then through the overthrow, if you will, or discarding of Keynesian economic prescriptions and the welfare state in favor of neoliberalism in the late 70s. So, everybody knows about Margaret Thatcher coming to power in Britain and Ronald Reagan in the United States, and people talk about Thatcherism and Reaganism. Well, in fact, really what it was this shift away from Keynesian politics in favor of supply-side economics, the Chicago School of Economics, Milton Friedman's approach, which was, in fact, to free up the dynamics of the market, to take the state out of away from its interventionist role in the economy, and to sharpen the direct and indirect costs, sharpen the attack on the both directly and indirectly on the costs of labor. And they did this by attacking the trade union movement, the coal miners in Britain, unions in not only North America but in many other parts of the world, to drive down wages, to just impose sharp cuts on wages that had been fought for and gained by workers, particularly organized workers, throughout the post-war period, and also indirectly by undermining the social, what we call the social wage. This is the things that aren't necessarily in the pay packet, but they contribute to the overall income and well-being of the people. It could be in the form of pension packets and pension systems, public education, public health care, other social services that are delivered and compose part of the income of working people, but it's not in the pay packet. It's what we call a social wage. Also increasing the intensity of labor, longer work hours, and so on. Privatization, deregulation, and free trade, but is really not free trade, but the freeing the mobility of capital to move willy-nilly around the world to exploit resources and exploit people. And of course, to attack the redistributive role of governments, particularly those funds in government budgets that were going to pay for transfer to the provinces for social programs, for post-secondary education, for welfare, for health in the first place, and so on. And to say that we had to do this because we had to do something about this growing debt, a government debt, which was a burden on not only this generation, but future generations, our grandchildren, our children and grandchildren, and so on. They also did it by shifting the tax burden onto working people. So you saw big cuts in corporate taxation, which of course is still continuing even under Trump, and a shifting of the burden onto the working class and ordinary people, both in terms of income tax, but also in terms of things like sales tax and other regressive forms of taxation. So this graph shows the difference between the period before the mid-70s, the post-war period, on the left, where you can see that as productivity increased, that workers were also, their incomes were actually also increasing. And then all of a sudden, in the mid 70s and late 70s, as particularly as from around 1980 onwards, a growing gulf developing between the productivity of workers and how much they were actually being paid for. So that meant that all of the advances in terms of production methods and in terms of technology, all of the increases in productivity weren't being shared equally for society, and certainly they weren't benefiting the working class, but rather were going to increase the wealth of the ruling class and to further concentrate and centralize the accumulation of capital. You can see this here again in this graph. It refers to male incomes, but we know that for women it was about 30%, and it continues to be about 30% below median male income. But it certainly makes the point that from 75 onwards, that's where you see the big difference between GDP growth and the income for working people. You see it again in this graph about household income versus GDP. And if we go back to the graph that we looked at earlier, you can see that from 1977 onwards, there was a significant rebound in terms of the amount of income and correspondingly wealth accumulation of the top 10%. So this frenzied drive to reverse the falling rate of profit since the late 70s was very successful for the capitalist class. Profits skyrocketed, much more than the incomes of working people. As a matter of fact, the real incomes of most workers has basically been static, and in some cases even declined for decades. And it succeeded in intensifying the relative and absolute impoverishment of the working class. But this, in turn, of course, was going to lead to another classic capitalist crisis, a decline in consumption, corresponding overproduction, and an economic slump. So how then did the ruling class stave off another crisis in the late 90s, particularly as this expansion started to level out and lose steam? Well, they used a number of market mechanisms and state regulation to forestall the onset of a new recession or depression, and they did it through the massive extension of debt. So if you look here, you can see this is the household debt. This is what most people have in terms of a share of how much debt each household or an average household owes as part of the GDP. You can see that from starting in 79 and 82 right here on the graph, a massive increase right up until the great meltdown of 2008, the economic financial crisis of 2008, a massive increase in household debt. Similarly, with respect to disposable income. And of course, correspondingly, a big drop in terms of household savings, how much people were actually banking away for rainy days, such as the current period that we're having. In fact, today it's estimated that the level of household debt and the level corresponding low level of savings has never been either higher or lower than it is today. And here are some quick statistics about how that debt increased. And by the way, when we're talking about debt, we're not talking about household debt, government debt, but also corporate debt itself. How it grew tremendously from over one decade, from 97 to 2007, to the eve of the financial crisis. And you can see it in this graph as well with respect, this is a US graph, but it's very similar in Canada to the relationship between debt and the national income. The massive gulf that developed, particularly from the mid-90s up until the financial crisis. So you had the meltdown. Eventually the bubble had to burst. There were loan defaults, stock market plunges, a tightening of credit, a sea of bankruptcies, layoffs, and home foreclosures. And although it was uneven, it had a global impact, including and very severely in developing countries and third world countries. the state response virtually everywhere was to bail out the rich and to preserve their assets that were under threat, around the grounds that they were too big to fail. So we had to feed the rich, and the rest of us were obviously not too big to fail, so we were allowed to fail, and people lost their homes, they lost their jobs, they lost their savings, and I don't mean just immediate savings, but the retirement savings as well. There was a massive injection of liquidity, or quantitative easing it's called, but this is basically printing money to bail out monopoly capital. But they couldn't just print the money without having somebody paying it back, because that would have massively increased inflation, and they didn't want that. So this became part of government debt, or public debt, which then was used as a basis to further increase pressure on the real wages of people. At the time, of course, they talked about the death of neoliberalism, that this showed that neoliberalism was a failed strategy and it was the end. And we saw all sorts of different characterizations of it. You know, that's all folks from Reagan and Thatcher, and this is the death of neoliberalism, the scourge of neoliberalism, what comes next after neoliberalism, the rise and fall, and so on. There was all sorts of talk about this, but of course we know, and we predicted at the time, that in fact there was not going to be a turn away by ruling circles from neoliberal prescriptions, but in fact they were going to try to cure or finance a recovery based on more neoliberalism, and that's in fact what they did. So we had the jobless recovery, further concentration, centralization of capital, a flurry of mergers and takeovers. So you had a further consolidation of wealth and a concentration of within the ranks of monopoly capital, and so on. And of course, a widening income and social disparities internationally and within each capitalist state. And of course, we all know that this is very well documented. And a reinflating of the debt bubble, so that since the crisis in 2008, 2009, you can see how well corporate profits recovered, and correspondingly you can see what happened in terms of median income. If you look up on the right-hand part of this graph, from 2010 up until the present, you can see that household income was, you know, it went up a little bit, but the GDP, that's to say the overall wealth in society, took off like a rocket. And this is reflected, of course, in the distribution of wealth. The top 10%, and of course we know the top 1% owning, you know, 50% of all of the accumulated wealth in the world. And correspondingly, you can see how global debt has increased since the last crisis. So for all the talk about, well, we have to make sure that the debt bubble doesn't develop again. In fact, it has doubled, more than doubled, compared to where we were at in 2008 on the eve of the meltdown of 2008, 2009. And you can see here reflected also in terms of the growth of corporate debt over that period. Of course, another measure that was used, of course, was to increase the expenditures for the military-industrial complex. So you see another spike over on the right-hand side of this graph in the period following the economic financial crisis of 2008, 2009. So this brings us up to today, and I'm going to end now because I've run a little bit over time. But you can see that this argument that the pandemic is causing this economic crisis and the coming recession is rubbish, that in fact the contradictions were building up within the capitalist economy, the global capitalist economy, and the Canadian economy itself, quite independently of the outbreak of the pandemic in January and February. As a matter of fact, the IMF was warning about it in January. JP Morgan was saying the next financial crisis will strike in 2020 or 2021. Forbes and so on. All of these quotes that you see here are actually from before the pandemic even started. And this wasn't just a handful of commentators. This was a poll that was taken in November of 2019 amongst financial managers and analysts and economists, bourgeois economists, not Marxist economists, around the world. And you can see how between 2020 or 2021, almost 80% of all of these bourgeois analysts were saying that there's going to be another recession. And of course, we're already seeing that unfold now. It's not a looming crisis. It has already struck. And of course, the pandemic triggered that crisis. Fall in production, in retail trade, consumption, international trade, a drop in oil prices, and of course, the impact of punitive sanctions, which we can talk about some more as well. And of course, the impact on markets, stock market prices, and the financial sphere. I think the big point, the one last point I want to leave you with, is that the difference between the crisis in 2008, 2009 and the current crisis is that in 2008, 2009, it was a crisis in the financial sector. Okay, it was an issue relating to financialization. That's why it broke out in mortgages and mortgage defaults and so on and so forth, because of the debt bubble. This crisis, however, is a combination of a crisis around debt and impacting on the financial sector, but also a crisis in the real economy itself, an absolute drop in the production of goods and services. And it will be a protracted drop, and why we anticipate that it will be not only very severe, but it will go on for some time. And as you know, this is going to impact the working class, and the ruling class will make every effort to make sure the working class pays for this crisis, both through changes in the workplace, the permanent elimination of jobs, and the marginalization of sections of the working class, drops in real incomes, and of course, attacks on the social programs that working people rely upon. I think the last point is that we need to always bear in mind that this crisis, which is both a cyclical crisis related to relative overproduction and neoliberal policies and the massive extension of debt and so on and so forth, merges with structural aspects of the crisis of capitalism, the two most important being militarization and environmental devastation. So I'm going to stop there.
Thank you very much, Miguel, and thank you for that presentation. Very, very informative on that history and causes. And there'll be, as Miguel has said, some overlap in our discussions, as there is bound to be, given that we're discussing the same topic and dealing with many of the same factors and issues that arise. So the economic crisis, as Miguel has said, that we are experiencing and will continue to experience, was already in the making before the pandemic. But the scale of this economic crisis, both precipitated by and amplified by the health crisis, is looking increasingly likely to become even more severe than the Great Depression of the 1930s. Last week in this presentation, I said that 10 million American workers had filed for unemployment. The figure is now approaching 20 million. That's 13.4% of the labor force on top of the pre-existing, officially acknowledged rate of 3.6% unemployment, which economists always assume is about double the real unemployment rate, is about double that, which would make it 7. So we're now looking at a rate that's close to 20% or over. And the pandemic isn't over, so we may see continuing declines as a result of that. The situation in Canada will mirror this image. Over 1 million Canadians applied for the crisis benefit in the first 2 days that people could apply, and now the number is nearly 5.4 million, with thousands left to be processed. The unemployment rate in the United States during the Great Depression peaked at just over 24%, and we're already hearing predictions that during this crisis, it may be going over 32%. But any way you slice it, it's going to be bad. And as always, when capitalism crashes, it's the working class which is crushed under its collapsing weight. Miguel's presentation has outlined the history and the causes of the cyclical recessions, and I want to pick up on the point that he mentioned and referred to, the tendency of the rate of profit to fall over time. The reason I want to deal with this is because during a recession or depression, all of the factors that contribute to the falling rate of profit are altered or can be altered by the capitalist class to reverse that decline. Now, you're going to have to bear with me here, comrades, because I'm going to try. Oh no, that's not what I want to do. I got to go. Jeanne is not what you call technologically skilled, so it takes her a bit of time to do this. So most Marxists proffer, and this is, Miguel did this as well, and pointed out it, most Marxists proffer at least four, excuse me, I forgot to do that before I started my presentation, and I meant to. Most Marxists proffer at least four, and in my list there's a fifth way in which the capitalist class can push the rate of profit back up. You can increase the intensity of exploitation. This can be done by introducing new technology, by speed up, by removing benefits such as pensions, by reducing breaks in order to lengthen the workday, or by forcing unpaid overtime. You can have a deviation of the wage rate from the value of labor power. You can use existing and increase the amount of relative surplus population. The relative cheapening of the elements of constant capital is another variable. And you reduce the share of the social wage of workers by reducing the amount of taxes that the corporations pay to the state or to the amount that they get. Now, what is apparent on all these measures, except the one denoted by the arrow? Oh, I know what I've done here. I've not done this one. Sorry, this one. See, I told you I was incompetent. Now, what is apparent is that of all these measures, except the one denoted by the arrow, are remedies that occur by squeezing the working class. They are all, with the one exception, just different ways of saying the same thing: push wages down. Either you push wages down relatively by exploiting them more, or you push wages down absolutely by lowering wages, or you push wages down by gutting the social services that form the part of their wages known as the social wage, or by paying a lesser share of the cost of those services through corporate tax cuts. And the way you make workers accept this lowering of their wages is to intensify the pressure of economic insecurity and unemployment, nicely phrased there as relative surplus population. The lowering of constant capital is the one thing that they do to each other. And interestingly, it is the most effective way to raise the rate of profit. The increasing amount of capital spent on constant capital, plant and machinery, relative to variable capital, labor power, is what causes the rate of profit to decline. Drastically lowering the cost of constant capital is what most successfully improves that rate. The gobbling up of bankrupt firms, the purchase at fire sale prices of existing plant and equipment, lowers the cost of constant capital and raises the rate of profit. Now, hold on here. I've got to figure out how to do this. I knew. Okay, there it is. Right. Okay. The declining rate of profit was already having its effect on a number of industries: airlines, fossil fuels, mining, to name a few. Now the process has accelerated, and the pandemic is the accelerant. It has accelerated the rate and expanded the scope of the economic crisis. Walking around your town or city today, you will see it happening. Businesses have already started shuttering their windows as they walk away from their business too small and too low profit to withstand even a short period of loss of income with little decrease in the costs of rent, electricity, taxes, etc. Restaurants, bars, hairdressers, shoe stores, jewelry stores, clothing stores. Some are closing their doors never to open them again. Even some small businesses not closed due to the pandemic, but unable to sustain themselves in the face of declining customer base as people stay at home, are finding that they can no longer survive. The sharks are circling. The big fish will be eating the little fish. On a larger scale, it is also happening to larger bourgeois enterprises. The oil industry is rife with companies going belly up and walking away from their holdings, leaving what is called orphan wells as a blight and a contaminant on the landscape to be cleaned up by the state, as Trudeau announced this week Ottawa would be paying to do. Mining companies were seeing falling stock prices, and those that were still showing growth were deemed to be in a bubble that would soon burst. The airline industry was engaged in massive stock buybacks to hide their fragile hold on financial viability. All the previous owners, operators, and workers within those businesses and companies which go under will become part of those looking for work, the relative surplus population. And the constant capital they once owned will become the property of larger companies at prices much below their real value. And that is the basis of the new owner's higher rate of profit. This is capital continuing to concentrate and centralize. It has been a couple of years since it was announced that 8 people owned wealth equivalent to the amount held by the bottom 50% of the world. As of now, 3 Americans, Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, and Jeff Bezos, own wealth equivalent to the bottom 50% of the American population. Can it get more extreme than that without huge cracks beginning to show in the very structure itself? Now, if this concentration and centralization of capital via the liquidation of some enterprises to the benefit of the remaining ones was the only effect of the recession/depression, the working class could sit back and watch the capitalists eat each other like the Ouroboros dragon eating its own tail until they were all gone. Unfortunately, they insist the working class do its part to help them out of their crisis by lowering labor's cost. Many will be laid off beyond the layoffs of the pandemic that the pandemic has imposed through isolation and the forced closure of businesses and services. And once the medical emergency is over, those who still have a job will be under severe pressure to accept a lower wage and benefit package than they presently receive, either immediately or through the passage of time without any increase in wages. New job applicants will be offered jobs at a rate lower than it was previously paid, or be asked to accept part-time or contract work. And at the very least, demands for improvement in wages or benefits will be treated as outrageous, bordering on mindless. So, we have a medical crisis and an economic crisis. The medical crisis will end through the efforts of hardworking medical practitioners in a variety of fields. And we will all hope that some of that hard work will result in a vaccine so that in the future, this particular virus will have no greater effect than the regular flu season. And we have an economic crisis which will not end with the end of the pandemic. And when the economic crisis ends, it will do so by having set in place the very conditions for its next appearance, perhaps in an even more extreme manifestation. And between the two events, the end of the medical crisis and the end of the economic crisis, you have us, the working class, bearing the brunt of the failure of their system. And as usual, those who suffered the most during the recovery and boom stages of capitalism will suffer them even more during its crisis stage. The poor, the precariously employed, the women, the indigenous communities, the racialized, the homeless, all of the disadvantaged of our society will experience an intensification of that disadvantage. We know how they are planning to solve this crisis. The first thing to say is that they will hide behind the pandemic, introduce policies to fight the economic crisis, and claim they are fighting the pandemic. As Obama's chief of staff so famously said, never let a crisis go to waste. They may be fighting the pandemic, but they are already fighting the recession as well. They will use the pandemic as a screen behind which they will transfer obscene amounts of money from the working class to themselves. It's already happening, as the bailout packages are used to bolster the corporate world. In the US, airlines that were buying back their own stock to prop up the price have already received a pledge of $50 billion. Banks are back at the trough. In the United States, it said that they will be receiving up to $1.5 trillion. They will be looking to offset their losses from what will be a rising tide of unpaid debts. And corporations that transferred jobs to low-wage economies and destroyed the communities they left behind have arrived with their hands out. In Canada, the fund to pay workers 75% of their wages while the businesses are closed is being paid not to the workers, but to the enterprises to maintain the employment link. But it will be a gift to the corporation, which comes out of the taxes of working people. In the US, the amount that will be spent on the bailout is predicted to reach $6.2 trillion. $4.5 trillion of that is slated for the large corporations, some of the obscene money to which I referred. The remaining $1.4 trillion will be shared between small businesses, local and state governments, hospitals, many of which are large corporations or part of them, and individuals. The figure that is estimated for individuals is $500 billion, which works out to $1,200 each, and that's what they're getting. They will use the medical crisis to enact legislation, allowing greater infringements on the democratic rights of the people. Tracking devices, facial recognition, surveillance of the population, censorship, detention without trial, deployment of soldiers, expansion of police powers. In one country or another, all these measures have been proposed or already enacted. And all of the measures introduced now in the guise of the fight against the pandemic will be used to limit and quell opposition to and the struggle against the consequences of the economic crisis that will follow. They will use this crisis to pursue their long-term foreign policy objectives, free from the scrutiny to which it would normally be subjected. Who is watching the escalation of threats to Venezuela when there is a pandemic at the door? Who thinks that Trump's mindless twittering about the Chinese virus is anything other than the blather for which he is so famous? In fact, it is an expression of the pre-existing hostility that has been growing on the part of the American bourgeoisie to the burgeoning world strength of China. Who is paying attention to the plight of Haiti, Iran, Syria, Palestine? The sanctions and boycotts, isolation and embargoes, threat of military intervention and blockades under the condition of a pandemic are not a continuation of policy, but an escalation of hostility. It is callous and brutal, a crime against humanity, to refuse any nation access to the wherewithal to fight a pandemic. And under the conditions of a pandemic, how do we protest? How do we manifest our opposition? I'm getting to another slide here. So that is what they will offer as a solution to the crisis we are in and the one that is coming. The transfer of incomprehensible amounts of money from our pockets to theirs, the introduction of repressive legislation to limit opposition to their economic policies, and the intensification of policies against any nation which would resist their pursuit of unimpeded access to the world's resources and markets. And what do we, the Communist Party, propose as an alternative? The first thing we need to do, and I realize this is a shopping list, but if you're going to have a program, you got to have a shopping list of what you want, and here it is. The first thing we need to do, if for no other reason than that this will not be the only pandemic that we see in the years ahead, fix the healthcare system. That system has taken a beating. Years of austerity, of cuts and even more cuts, of governments that subjected the healthcare system to corporate supply chain policies, just in time or on demand, as if healthcare was a t-shirt or a pizza to be made when somebody ordered it. It is these policies that has resulted in a system cracking under the weight of this emergency. We're paying the price of all those closed hospitals, hospital beds, for the underfunding of research, the sale of socially owned research labs. the understaffing of hospitals, the contracting out and privatization of hospital and healthcare services. What good is a healthcare system that can only function when nothing goes wrong? It's like having a fire department in a large city, only able to fight one fire at a time. You know, there was a time in Canada when the postal routes were based not on how long it took to walk the route on a good day, but how long it would take if there was a snowstorm. To the corporate mind, that looks like waste. To the citizen who got their mail, don't get emails by postal service, even when it snowed, it looked like good service. We must reject the corporate mantra of lean and mean. We want a healthcare system not lean, but well-fed, not mean, but resilient, strong enough to still function during medical crises. It's time to reverse the cuts and expand the number of beds, the number of staff, the number of hospitals. It's time to expand our notion of healthcare to include dental health, mental health, vision, hearing, long-term care for the elderly. It's time not only for free prescriptions, but the development of a socially owned and funded pharmaceutical industry based on research that's socially funded and owned. So that the next time a medical crisis arrives, and arrive it will, the system can handle it. And let's make sure that when a vaccine is developed, it is owned publicly, not privately, universally available, not a commodity for profit. Use the bailout money to fund the construction of affordable housing, and not just affordable, but social housing. Use it to provide employment insurance income for all workers at 90% of previous income without any cutoff. To introduce a guaranteed annual livable income, to provide not a net, but a floor through which people will not be allowed to fall. It's time to improve all the social services that have been gutted, and we need to raise pensions. Make the Bank of Canada the lending institution for government, and ensure that any money given to corporations, which they will get a lot, comes with public equity in the company. And where there is a public interest, the pharmaceutical industry, for instance, insurance and some others, let's nationalize them. Give financial support to small businesses, farmers, fishers, single proprietor operations, and cut the military spending to release even more funds to ameliorate the effects of the crisis. Stop all evictions, renovictions, and foreclosures. Cancel student and credit card debt. Defer all personal debt, mortgages, and loans. In fact, the American economist Michael Hudson proposes that all non-corporate debt should just be canceled, like hitting the reset button on your computer, reset the economy. He says it's been done in the past and to good effect. We demand jobs, good jobs, value-added jobs. We want an end to precarious jobs because precarious jobs mean precarious incomes, precarious housing, precarious nutrition, precarious health, precarious lives. We want investment in infrastructure, public transit, clean water for Indigenous communities, sustainable energy. We want the rights of Indigenous peoples and nations to be recognized and respected, including the right to have the final say over development on their lands, any and all developments. And free public childcare is now an even greater necessity if women are not to be pushed out of the workforce by this crisis. And women are already feeling the effects of the layoffs disproportionately. And this thing that I have up here now exposes that rather remarkably. Women are 47% of the workforce, but 63% of all the job losses in March. If you look only at the 25 to 54 age group, women represent 70% of all job losses. The number of women in this age group who lost their job is double the number of men in the same age group who lost theirs, 298.5 to 144. 1.2 million women lost at least 1/2 of their work hours, and 1.8 lost their jobs or at least 1/2 of the work hours. That's 1 in 5 women in the workforce. 20% of the women in the workforce have that experience. In some sectors, women account for almost 100% of the jobs lost. You know which ones. 15% of all the jobs lost are in the sales and service sectors, and a sector obviously dominated by women. Okay, so let me get back here to doing what I'm doing. Excuse me while I do this. Okay. They measure, okay, hold on, I gotta get this over here. They measure the economy by the levels of profit. We measure it by the levels of employment and the level of the standard of living of the people. Their solution to the crisis is to demand policies to raise the rate of profit. Our solution is to demand policies to raise wages and living standards. As communists, we need to be in the front lines, not in the medical campaign to defeat the virus, but on the front lines of the campaign to defeat the policies that the capitalist class will try to impose on the working class as a result of the economic crisis. On the front lines in the defense of jobs and housing and services and the environment and democratic rights. We must be advocates in the defense of working people, in whatever forum we participate, in every organization to which we belong. We must be advocates for policies that will stop the capitalist imposed solutions and advance a working class solution. We must be articulate advocates for these policies, the policies of the Communist Party of Canada. But all those demands, they are reforms to the capitalist system. Excuse me, necessary reforms, reforms needed to sustain and improve the lives of working people, necessary to stop the capitalist class from squeezing the working class harder and more thoroughly, to stop them from making us the solution as well as the victims of their crisis. But they are reforms, and we are a revolutionary party, a party that does not want only to protect the working class, but to free it from the system which can never meet its needs. A system which will continue to experience cyclical recessions and which will continue to expect the working class to suck up the costs of recovery from those recessions. Our goal is to rid the working class of the system based on the exploitation of their labor. If we were to use a medical analogy, economic crises are the symptom, capitalism is the disease. Reforms address the symptoms to reduce the damage that the crisis does. But we need to get rid of the disease, capitalism. We must expose the system for what it is, based on exploitation, with growing inequality, increasing number of wars, incapable of solving the real issues of climate change and environmental degradation, and unable to offer anything but more of the same. Now more than ever, our analysis of the system is needed. Now more than ever, it will be heard. We must advocate for a change to the system, advocate for a new society based on the needs of working people, not the needs of the handful of corporate giants, the men and women who own them. We must find new and innovative ways to present and persuade, to expose the true nature of the system, and to convince others that capitalism isn't the only way, that a world without exploitation, without want or war, without racism or sexism, that such a world is not only desirable, but possible. And we must do our utmost to convince them to join with us to make that possibility a reality. Thank you.
Honraré a los caídos luchando, Tlatelolco no fue su final. Un glorioso vivir tendrán cuando construyamos una nueva sociedad. Abolir para siempre queremos un sistema en que la explotación que del hombre por el hombre se hace no condición. Honraré a los caídos luchando, no conozco sus nombres y sé que por nombre podría darle a muchos el glorioso y bello nombre del Che. Yo también me incorporo a las filas del que lucha contra la opresión, del que lucha contra la injusticia de un sistema de ignominia y corrupción. Honraré a los caídos luchando, Tlatelolco no fue su final, porque habrán de vivir en el triunfo del que lucha por la nueva sociedad. Adelante, adelante, marchemos, cada vez con cautela mayor, en la escuela, en el monte y el pueblo, movimiento estudiantil contigo estoy, movimiento estudiantil.